Hey there guys, and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm gonna film my video about all the books I read in 2020. This is one of my favorite videos and one of my least favorite videos at the same time, because it's a bitch to film. It's also a bitch to edit, but I love looking back on these, so I hope that this will be interesting for you. I will start off with a couple of stats and then I will go through all the books that I have read this year, but I will only talk about the very worst and the very best, and all the middle ones I will just mention, so this video isn't like 3 hours long. So first of all, let's get into the stats. I am using a spreadsheet and I will link the video down below where you can get the spreadsheet for 2021 if you're interested in using one as well. And I'll try to edit in some little pictures so it's easier to understand what I'm going to say. So in 2020 I managed to read 89 books, and that is quite an impressive number for me. I usually read about between 70 and 85 books depending on my year. So 89 is a little bit more, which is not surprising for me because other than other people this year, I didn't really have much more time to read. Obviously a little bit because of staying at home all the time, but I still had to work a lot and I had very stressful times at work and stuff like that. So I'm not surprised that I didn't read like 110 books or something. So 89 is great for me, and I must admit I haven't counted the pages yet, so I will probably do that later and enter a little clip where I talk about my page count right now. So I did the math now and I have read 25,580 pages in 2020. That means I have read around 2,000 pages a month and also around 70 pages a day, and my goal is to read more than an average of 50 pages a day, so I was very successful with that. And apart from that, I listened to 11,196 minutes of audiobook, and that means per month I listen to around 930 minutes and per day around 30 minutes. And again, this is kind of my goal. I think like 30 minutes a day is a very good average. So I don't count my audiobooks as pages read, so these are separate, and that is what I have read in numbers. So in total I have spent around 340 euro on books this year, and my book buying is very interesting because I always tend to buy books at the end of the year. So in like September, October, November and December is when I buy the most books, because usually that's when I start running out of books that I'm interested in. Because of Christmas and my birthday in January, I usually have a couple of books that I'm really interested in the beginning of the year. Then I also got a ton from the library and stuff like that. So yeah, my spending is always a bit skewed. And then I saved around 360 euros through using library books, and I had checked out 27 books that I actually read from the library this year. I also had like 3 or 4 that I had to return unread because they were due and I didn't have time to read them. But I didn't count them into the amount that I saved because obviously I haven't read them yet. So yeah, I like that it is kind of balanced in that way, because I do like buying books that I'm interested in, because I live in Germany, so my library doesn't have a lot of English books, and so when there's new releases that are not translated yet, it takes years before they end up in my library. So I also like to read backlist books that are easy to get from the library, so I try to balance that out a little bit by supporting, new authors that I love, but then also getting backlist books from the library to support my local library as well. Because here in Germany we actually do pay a fee to be able to use the library, so it goes to a good cause. So I actually read the most books in August with 12 books. Please excuse my cat, she is really annoyed today and really wants to show me that. So yeah, she will pop up here and there. But I read 12 books in August, which was my best reading month when you count the books. And that was because there was the Newts, I think the last round of the Newts going on. The Magical Readathon has basically yeah, stopped now with the Harry Potter theme, so I hope it will be back this year, but just not Harry Potter themed anymore. But yeah, Magical Readathon is always a time when I read a ton. So my 2 other best months were July with the Reading Rush and April with the first round of the Magical Readathon. And yeah, the other months were also quite good. I think my worst month, yeah, February, March, and October. No, not October. September is when I read the least amount of books, but September was when I started reading Les Miserables, so that doesn't really count. I mean, if you read 5 books and Les Miserables, I think that is quite a good month as well. So quickly talking about the genre that I read, my favorite genre is fantasy, so I'm not surprised that I read a ton of fantasy last year, even though I would love to read more like really high fantasy, and I feel like the stuff that I read isn't that, because usually high fantasy are like huge series that intimidate me. But yeah, that is not a surprise, but I also like to read a ton of other stuff, so you can see that I read from quite a few genres last year. For star ratings, you will see that when I go through all the books, but I gave most of the books I read 3.5 or 4 stars, which is great because that means that I enjoyed these books. But I also had a couple of really bad books. So this year I had a 1.5 star, I had a 2 star, and I had 3 2.5 star, which are books that I would not recommend. And you will see those as we go through. And then I also had 14 5-star books, but a lot of these were actually rereads because I reread a couple of books this year and it was really, really good. I've actually read about a third of my books in translation, which usually would be a translation from English, but I also had some Japanese and some French books in there, so yeah, it's a kind of a nice mixture. And then about 2/3 of the book I have read in the language that they were written in, so English books that I've read in English and German books that I've read in German. And yeah, I think that is pretty average for me. As I said, when I get books from the library, they usually translated into German, but not always. So yeah, that's kind of the thing there. What I also found interesting is that I only read 35% of the books from my actual TBR. You will see that the numbers don't add up to 100%. That is because I also had the information in there for books I DNF'd, which I don't count. So I don't count them as finished, so I have more than 100%. It's a little bit confusing, but you'll get through it. But around 35% of my reading was from my actual TBR that I had at the beginning of the year. And then about 70% of the books that I have read, or at least started reading, were kind of new stuff. That means they were either library books or books that I bought or were gifted during the year. So yeah, I'm not that good at reading books that I already have on my shelves, and I thought this number would be much different because of all the readathons that really got me to read them books that I had on my TBR for so long. But yeah, I just really like having no TBR and just getting books and reading them as I go. So yeah, but I still have managed to cut my TBR down a little bit this year, which is great, because I have read about around 30 books that were already on my TBR, and I think from the books that I have bought new, I only have like maybe 5 or so that I haven't read yet, so it's not that crazy. So maybe let's talk about the authors a little bit that I've read. It is not surprising that I read the majority of my books from female authors. That has been the case for a very long time now. So I read about 2/3 of my books from female authors, but I'm also glad that I read books from trans authors this year and also non-binary authors, or one non-binary author, I think, but it's still good. I feel like I can still do much better with that, but I, try to go about that just, being proud of myself for every step. So yeah, I definitely want to focus on that more next year, or this year in 2021, reading like trans and non-binary authors, because I have really enjoyed the books that I've read by them. And yeah, as I said, majority of my books, female authors. That will probably never change, and I really don't want it to change, so that can always be the majority. And I usually rate the books of female authors higher than books of male authors because they just speak to me more. Also, speaking of the race of the authors, I have only divided this into white authors and people of color, and yeah, not so proud of that one. So about 3/4 of my books were from white authors, and that definitely needs to change as well, because honestly, whenever I read books that were written by authors of color, I do rate them higher because they're usually better quality, to be honest. And yeah, so I definitely want to work on that a lot next year. I tell that to myself every year, but this is just something that I need to be working on. Now, with the country of origin or the continent, I only did the continent thing. Yeah, most of my books are from North American authors, unfortunately, and then the next one is Europe. I feel like this year I've been particularly bad with this one. I mean, I have read a book from every single continent, but yeah, I did really bad this year with the continents, I have to be honest. So I really want to have more diversity with that next year. And then also something that I do find every single year is that the majority of the books I read are from authors that I haven't known before. So about 60% of my books are from authors that I have not read a book of before, and only around 40% are authors that I have read a book from before. So yeah. I don't know how I feel about this. I feel like I should concentrate more on authors that I know and love. I have a few of them where I've pretty much read everything now, like Tahara Mafi, Leigh Bardugo, Tolkien. And then I have a couple that I want to read more because I love their work, but I just don't. So yeah, Tessa Gretton is one of those where I have read her books so far, for example. But yeah, there's just so many great authors that I really love the book from. Angie Thomas as well is one of those where I have every book, where I've read every book so far. So yeah, as I said, I just want to make sure that the authors that I do really like are not like one-hit wonders for me. So yeah, but on the other hand, I love discovering new authors. So maybe if I get it more to like 50-50 next year, I would be happy. Okay, maybe the last two things I wanted to mention. One is the age group. Now, I always read the majority of adult fiction and then a little bit of YA and usually only a small amount of middle grade. But that is just what my reading taste is, and I must say that I would like to have a little bit more middle grade and maybe a little bit less YA next year, but we'll see about that. But I feel very good with the amount of adult I'm reading because I am an adult and I feel like these are kind of books that speak to me the most. So yeah, I'm quite happy with that stat. And then for the format, it's also not surprising at all. I read mostly paperbacks, but I've also read a couple of hardbacks. Those are usually gifts or from the library. And I have read quite a few audiobooks this year, which is something that I've been slowly building up over the years now. And I love listening to audiobooks. And yeah, I just feel very good about that. The great thing about audiobooks for me is that I don't have like a backlist, so I only get the one audiobook I'm in the mood for and then I listen to it and then I get the next one. And that way I have that kind of thing which I mentioned, that I really like buying books, reading them, buying new books, reading them, and not like stacking up like a huge TBR. And so yeah, I've been really enjoying all the audiobooks. I don't think I had a bad one this year, but we'll see. I will mention it if I go through the books and I find one. So yeah, I think that would be all the stats I wanted to talk about. If you're interested in any more stats, just let me know and I can look up whether I've tracked it. And that would be this part. And now we're going into all the books that I have read in 2020. And we're starting off with a good one, or rather a very bad one. This was a 1.5 star read for me. This is Northanger Abbey, a retelling by Well McDermott. And in my humble opinion, this book shouldn't exist. It was horrible. I really disliked it, and the only reason why I gave it a 1.5 is that I thought that the writing style was still a little bit Austen-esque. That's it. The rest of the book is trash. Don't read this. It's offensive, it's bad, and just read the original. And I didn't even like the original that much, so yeah, this was bad. And then for 2 stars, we have another bad book, and it is this German book called Tanz des Vergessens by Heidi Rehn, and this is a book set in the 1920s, and this was also just bad. Like, I don't think any one of you will ever read this, but if you are German and you've ever considered it, don't. This was such trash. I mean, I love the 20s, but yeah, the only reason I gave this 2 stars was that it discusses a little bit of the rise of Hitler, but all the other stuff was bad. Now we're getting into the 2.5 star books, and the first one I have already gotten rid of because I read it right at the beginning of the year and I didn't want to see it anymore, and that was a book in a series by MC Beaton. I don't remember the title. In English, it is called Death of a Hussy, and it is in the Hamish Macbeth series. And this book was just so bad as well. It was like a very lame mystery book where you had to read 50% of it before the crime actually happened. And then it was so full of like fat phobia. It was horrendous. I really, really would not recommend that book. And I don't even know why I gave it 2.5 stars, because it probably deserved the 2 stars. But we'll just look over that now and move on. Then with 2.5 stars we have Brooklyn by Colm Tobin, something like that. I have no idea how to say that name. I'm sorry for that, but I dislike this book so much that I'm not going to look it up. This is about an Irish girl in like the 50s or something. Yeah, and she decides to... No, she doesn't decide. That's the point. She doesn't decide anything in this book. All the people around her make decisions for her all the fucking time. And she doesn't decide anything at all. She's just like this puppet being dragged all over the place, having to move to the US and then back to Ireland and stuff like that. And this is supposed to be like a romance, but honestly, the main character is such a doormat that you feel sorry for the guys. Like, no, this book. I had already seen the movie because I love Saoirse Ronan, and the movie was like only okay because unfortunately it's a very, very close adaptation of the book. So I knew exactly what was going to happen. I knew exactly what the main character was like. And yeah, this was just not a good book. And then lastly, we have Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, which is also a book where I'm like, why didn't I give this 2 stars? Because it was not good at all. This book was written in the 30s, and that's just a time period that I don't vibe with at all. And so yeah, all the sexism, the racism, and everything like that in this book. Let me not get started on this whole like thing that it did with Indigenous people. No, I really dislike that book. And if you like this book, I don't know what kind of glasses you wore when you read it, because no, I just did not like it. And these were the worst books I've read last year, so now we're getting into the 3-star books. Okay, for 3-star books, we have, in no particular order, Truly Devious by Maureen Johnson, the first book in the Truly Devious series, and I listened to it on audio. The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes by Suzanne Collins. This is the prequel to the Hunger Games series, and yeah, did we need this? Unite Me by Tara Mafi. This is just a small collection of 2 short stories set in the Shadow Me verse. Graceling by Christine Kishore. This is the first book in the Graceling Realm series, and this was just not for me. Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno Garcia, which was spoiled for me, so maybe I would have enjoyed it more, but unfortunately not. Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier, also 30s book, not my thing. And lastly, Fresh Tracks by Georgia Beers, a lesbian winter story. Let's do the 3.5 stars, and there are a lot of those. We're starting off with The Hunting Party by Lucy Foley, a kind of murder mystery I listened to on audio. The Fifth Wave by Rick Yancey, the first book in the Fifth Wave series, which is all about aliens coming to Earth. The Last Star by Rick Yancey, the third book in the Fifth Wave series. Lady Hotspur by Tessa Cretton, a Shakespeare retelling that I listened to on audio. A book about fairy tales of Saxony. It's a German book that I got from the library. The Poet X by Elizabeth Acevedo, which is a story told in poetry. The Rosie Project by Graham Simsian. Don't know how to say the name, sorry. This is a kind of romance story with a main character that could be neurodiverse, but I'm not sure about that. The Iron Age by Arja Kajärmo, which was a book about the 50s in Finland. The Vanishing Stair by Maureen Johnson, the second book in the Truly Devious series. Tränenmond by Warda Saio, and this is a memoir of a woman who grew up in Morocco, I believe. The first part of A Dance of Dragons by George R. R. Martin, which is part of the Game of Thrones series. The Hand on the Wall by Maureen Johnson, which is the third and final book in the Truly Devious series. Shadow Me and Unravel Me by Tahereh Mafi, which is book 1 and 2 in the Shadow Me series, and this was a reread for me. If We Were Villains by M.L. Rio, this is a kind of Shakespeare-inspired dark academia book. Fairest of All by Serena Valentino, which is in the Disney Villains series. Smith of Wootton Major by Tolkien, which is one of those little stories he wrote that has nothing to do with Middle-earth. The fourth volume of this manga series about a small cat called Chi by Konami Kanata. The Woman in Cabin 10 by Ruth Ware. It's a thriller that I got from the library. Spontaneous by Aaron Starmer, which is kind of a weird book about growing up. Things We Say in the Dark by Kirsty Logan, which is a dark short story collection. The Devouring Grey by Christine Lynn Herman, which is a very atmospheric darker fantasy story I listened to on audiobook, and it's the first one in a duology. The Haunting of Ashburn House by Darcy Coates, which is a horror story I listened to on audio. The Whispering Skull by Jonathan Stroud, which is the second book in the Lockwood & Co. series. Carmilla by J. Sheridan Le Fanu, and this is a classic vampire story, which is also a little bit sapphic. The fourth volume of a manga called Barefoot Gen by Keiji Nakasawa, and this is all about Hiroshima. Longburn by Joe Baker, which is a Pride and Prejudice retelling. And These Violent Delights by Chloe Gong, which is a Romeo and Juliet retelling set in 1920s Shanghai. Now let's move on to all the 4-star books. First we have Salt to the Sea by Ruta Sepetys, a YA historical fiction I got from the library. The Infinite Sea by Rick Yancey, the second book in the Fifth Wave trilogy. The Silence of the Girls by Pat Barker. This is a retelling of the Trojan War. The Rise and Fall of Dinosaurs by Steve Persett, which is a book about dinosaurs, but also about the science that is used to find dinosaurs. Liquid Modernity by Zygmunt Bauman, which is a Polish sociologist who wrote about modernity. A Spring Harvest by Geoffrey Buck Smith. And this was one of the friends of Tolkien who did not survive the war, and Tolkien then brought out this collection of his poems after his death. A Very Large Expanse of Sea by Tahereh Mafi, which is a YA contemporary book with a main character who is Muslim. Mouse by Art Spiegelman, which is a graphic novel where the author deals with the past of his Jewish father and mother, and they survived the Holocaust. Die Flügel meines schweren Herzens, which is a collection of poems by Arab poets, and I especially loved the very early ones from like centuries ago. Wayward Son by Rainbow Rowell, the sequel to Carry On. The Last Girl by Nadia Murad, which is a memoir about a girl who was taken by ISIS. Persepolis by Marjan Satrapi, which is a graphic novel about growing up in Iran. A Song Below Water by Bethany C. Morrow, which is a kind of urban fantasy centering around a siren. Beauty Greens by Libba Bray, which I listened to on audio and it was fantastic. Like, the audio production was great. I think this one is called A Man Called Ove by Fredrik Backman, and this focuses on a grumpy old guy in Sweden. The Deep by River Solomon, which focuses on black mermaids. Ignite Me by Tahara Mafi, the third book in the Shadow Me trilogy that then became a series. A Long Way to a Small Angry Planet by Becky Chambers, a sci-fi book I got from the library. Les Miserables by Victor Hugo, the longest book and also the longest classic I have read this year. The Deck of Omens by Christine Lynn Herman, the second book to the Devouring Grey. Horror Stir by Grady Hendrix, an imagination of IKEA in a horror setting. Cemetery Boys by Aidan Thomas, a book about a trans brujo who wants to show his family who he really is. The second and the third volume of Barefoot Jen by Keiichi Nakasawa. The Christmas Invitation by Trisha Ashley, a cozy Christmas family drama romance. And A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, which you probably all know. Now on to the 4.5 stars, so these are getting really good. Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel. This is a kind of post-apocalyptic book about a disease that is very similar to COVID. The Bear and the Nightingale by Catherine Arden, a Russia-inspired fantasy historical fiction book. This is the first book in the Winter Night trilogy. The Language of Thorns by Leigh Bardugo. This is a short story collection, kind of fairy tale-esque, set in the Grishaverse. Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo, which is a fantasy dark academia book with ghosts. The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, which is a book about the racism in the American incarceration system. Stories of Your Life and Others by Ted Chiang, which is a sci-fi short story collection, and Ted Chiang really is a master of his art. The Sundown Model by Simone de St. James. This is a book that really reminded me of Sadie. It is about feminism, it's a mystery thriller, and it has ghosts. The Library of the Unwritten by A.J. Hackwith, a book about a library in hell. Letters from Father Christmas by Tolkien. This is a collection of Christmas letters he wrote as Father Christmas to his children over, I think, 23 years or something like that. So are you ready for the 5-star books? So 5 stars, let's do the rereads first. We have Carry On by Rainbow Rowell. This is a gay fantasy book inspired by Harry Potter. Nevermore by Jessica Townsend, which is also comparable to Harry Potter in a way, but it follows a girl called Morrigan and its perfection. And then we have The Fellowship of the Ring and the Two Towers by Tolkien, book 1 and 2 in the Lord of the Rings series, which just my favorite series of all time, so best rereads ever. Okay guys, we are in the 5-star realm and I'm gonna do my top 10 now. And this is in the order leading up to the best book, but you could switch some books around. It's really hard because they're all amazing and I highly recommend them. So on the 10th spot, I have The Girl with 7 Names by Hyun-seo Lee. This is a book about a girl who kind of defected from North Korea. Her story was really interesting. I had read In Order to Live the year before that, and they are both very different, and so I definitely feel comfortable with recommending both of these because their stories are so different. I really enjoyed this one. I think North Korea is a very fascinating country, but then also I think stories about refugees are so important to understand what people go through to save their lives most of the time. Then on the 9th spot, we have War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells, which is a classic that completely took me by surprise. I had read The Island of Dr. Moreau and thought it was just fine, but The War of the Worlds, it's such an underrated classic, and if you have seen the horrible movie, don't go by that. It has nothing to do with this book, obviously, because the book is set in like the 1800s, and it is basically about how they thought aliens would be if they came to Earth. And during this story, H.G. Wells tried to show his fellow English people try to show them what colonialism was like and how horrible it is. So yeah, I absolutely loved this book. Then we have On the Come Up by Angie Thomas. This is the second book by this author that I've read, and I waited a long time because I was scared that it wouldn't live up to The Hate You Give, which was the first book, but it totally did. I loved Bree's story. I thought it was uplifting. It had like some twists and turns. It showed character development. And I also liked the way the rap was put in there. I know nothing about rap, so don't quote me on this, but I did enjoy this book a whole lot. Then we have the first volume of Barefoot Gen by Keiji Nakazawa. This is a manga series that is focused on the Hiroshima bombing, and Keiji Nakazawa is a survivor of that, so he actually was there, and what he is describing in this manga series is semi-autobiographical. Some things are changed. He has incorporated stuff that he didn't live through himself but was told by other survivors. And this first book is definitely the strongest. It's the best graphic novel I've ever read, and I would highly recommend to check it out because this is such an underrated series. Then on number 6 we have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson. I have been interested in this book because of the beautiful cover for the longest time, and then it was picked for book club, and this surprised me so much. I basically read this book one afternoon and it tore me apart. This is such a great book about female and male humans and how they interact and what that does to a person. I absolutely loved it. I was blown away, and I think this is my favorite classic this year. So yeah, great one. Then we have Felix Ever After by Kaysen Callender, which is a contemporary YA story about a transgender guy who is still struggling with his identity. He is totally sure that he's trans and that he's a guy, but then he has some doubts about it, and I thought this was such a good portrayal of teenage life, because honestly, when you're like 17, you don't have it all figured out. Like, I can tell you, I'm almost 30, I don't have it all figured out, and I loved that this book gave you such a really good example of how it is okay to still struggle and not have made up your mind completely, but still, you know, being accepted as a trans person by your family and your friends and stuff like that. It also had a romance. Romance for me was the weakest part, but apart from that, I loved it. Then on number 4 we have Educated by Tara Westover, which was the best memoir I read this year, and this is purely because of the way Tara Westover spoke of the kind of gaslighting that happened in her family, and it really opened my eyes to stuff that was going on in my family a couple of years ago, and it gave me this really, really good kind of inspiration to think about that again and to see how people made me feel bad because of things that were not my fault. And that is like the biggest lesson I took from this book, that if your family is weird and you want out, it's not your fault. So it's totally fine to make that decision to leave people behind, even though they might be your family, if they are toxic and if they endanger your life. And obviously what Tara Westover lived through is completely nuts. She's from a very, very religious family, and was, yeah, it's kind of a miracle that she's even still alive, to be honest. And yeah, it was just a very great story because obviously you admire her and the way she can put these things into words is amazing, but at the same time it's shocking. And yeah, it is just a very, very good memoir and deserves all the hype, I guess. So are you ready for my top 3? These might not be a surprise if you watched my early videos in 2020. On number 3 we have The Girl in the Tower by Catherine Arden. This is the second book in the Winter Night trilogy. This definitely gave me some Mulan vibes, but set in an historical Russia, and I loved it. I just loved it so much. It was fast-paced, you really felt for the character, and I think the Bear and the Nightingale is a little bit slower, but then you get into The Girl in the Tower and it just go, 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 go. And I really, really loved this book so much. On number 2 we have The Winter of the Witch by Catherine Arden, which is the third book in the Winter Night trilogy. And honestly, I don't think I've ever read such a good conclusion to a series. This did everything that I wanted it to and more. This is such a clever book. It has a lot of action, but it also has these kind of, I don't know, like deep thoughts in there. And it's just, basically, it is not like other books. It's not like other fantasy books, and it took me by surprise, and I just was so happy with the ending, and yeah, I don't think I've ever read such a good conclusion. And then on number 1 is the book I'm currently rereading because I love it so much, and that is Wondersmith by Jessica Townsend, the second book in the Morgan Crow series. And since I don't want to spoil anything, I'm not gonna say what this book is about, but this whole series is fantastic. I've already mentioned that I reread Nevermore, and that is like all the wrong way around. So I read Nevermore in 2019, and I think it was my favorite book, or my second favorite book of the year. And then I read Wondersmith at the beginning of 2020, and as you see, my favorite book of the year. And so at the end of 2020 I reread Nevermore, and now in 2021 I'm rereading Wondersmith to finally read Hollowpox, the third book, and I'm super excited. So yeah, maybe it wouldn't have been number 1 if I wasn't currently rereading it, but honestly, this series is just so great and I can't wait to get into the third book. So that would be it for this probably long video. I'm sorry about that, but I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you have a lovely time. Give it a like if you liked it, or leave a nice comment. I always appreciate those. And if you subscribe, I will talk to you soon. Bye!